December 29th, 1944, 23:40 hours, McGuire Field, Mindoro. Major Carroll Smith had 3 hours of fuel, 12 Japanese bombers were inbound, and 20,000 American troops slept in tents below. The pressure was suffocating. For 14 consecutive nights, Japanese bombers had attacked Mindoro, 334 air raid alerts. American engineers were building 2 airfields that would support the Lingayen Gulf invasion scheduled for January 9th. If those airfields weren't operational by January 1st, the invasion would be delayed. The Japanese understood what those airfields meant. They sent bombers every night to destroy them. Tonight, Smith's P-61 Black Widow was the only thing standing between those bombers and the men on the ground. No moon. Heavy clouds obscured the stars. The kind of darkness that made conventional fighters useless. American P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts dominated the daylight skies, but at night, Japanese bombers flew believing darkness made them invisible. They didn't know about the SCR-720 radar mounted in Smith's nose. They were about to learn. McGuire Field, Mindoro, 23:40 hours, Major Carroll C. Smith crouched in the cockpit of his P-61A Black Widow, watching his radar operator's compartment through the small connecting window. 26 years old, 43 combat missions, 4 confirmed kills. His hands moved across the instrument panel with mechanical precision. Behind him, Lieutenant Philip Porter hunched over the SCR-720 radar scope, his face illuminated by the green glow of the display. Porter's age was unspecified in his service record, but his precision was legendary. 6 months as a radar operator, 0 missed intercepts when he had a solid contact. "I have 4 contacts," Porter's voice came through the intercom, calm, clinical. Heading south, different altitudes, all closing on Mindoro. Smith scanned the sky through the canopy, saw nothing. Just blackness. Range? Nearest contact, 6 miles. The others are staggered behind, 8 to 12 miles out. Smith did the mathematics instantly. 4 contacts meant 4 bombers in immediate range. But intelligence had reported 12 Japanese aircraft inbound tonight. That meant 8 more were somewhere beyond radar range. Too far to intercept, too far to stop. The pressure was suffocating. For 14 consecutive nights, Japanese bombers had attacked Mindoro. 334 air raid alerts. The American engineers working below were building 2 airfields that would support the Lingayen Gulf invasion scheduled for January 9th. If those airfields weren't operational by January 1st, the invasion would be delayed. More American troops would die on the beaches. The Japanese understood the mathematics as clearly as Smith did. Destroy the airfields, delay the invasion, kill more Americans. Smith's 418th Night Fighter Squadron had arrived at Mindoro 3 days earlier on December 26th. They were the only dedicated night fighter unit within range. 1 squadron, 6 operational P-61 Black Widows, 18 pilots, 18 radar operators. Tonight, Smith and Porter were the only crew airborne, 1 aircraft, 12 Japanese bombers. If even half the bombers got through, the damage would be catastrophic. Fuel dumps, ammunition storage, engineering equipment, construction crews sleeping in tents. The mental image was clear. Burning aviation fuel spreading across crushed coral runways, secondary explosions from ammunition bunkers, screaming men trapped in canvas tents that offered 0 protection from fragmentation bombs. Smith pushed the thoughts away. Focused on the immediate problem. "Porter, you said 4 contacts in range?" "Affirmative, but 8 more are out there. I can see them fading in and out at maximum range." "They're hanging back." Smith understood immediately. The Japanese weren't committing all 12 bombers to a single attack run. They were sending 4 forward as the initial wave, testing the defenses. Drawing up American night fighters. Then the remaining 8 would slip through once the fighters were occupied. It was smart tactics. It would work, unless Smith changed the equation. "Porter!" "How long to intercept the first contact?" "At current speed, 3 minutes. But Major, if we engage 1 target, the other 3 will." "I know." Smith did know. The mathematics were brutal and unforgiving. His P-61 carried enough fuel for approximately 3 hours of flight time. Each intercept required roughly 10 minutes. Approach, engage, confirm kill, return to patrol altitude. That meant a maximum of 3 intercepts before fuel became critical. 3 kills out of 4 bombers in range. 1 would get through. 3 kills out of 12 bombers total. 9 would complete their mission. Unacceptable. Smith had trained for 18 months at Orlando Army Airfield in Florida, night fighter training, radar intercept procedures, instrument navigation in zero visibility, gunnery practice in total darkness. The training was exhaustive because night fighting was the most dangerous form of aerial combat. No visual references, no horizon, just instruments, radar returns, and the hope that you were tracking an enemy aircraft and not a friendly bomber returning from a mission. The 418th had been flying combat missions since November 1943, started with P-70 Havocs, then modified P-38 Lightnings with experimental radar that worked maybe 60% of the time. The P-61s arrived in September 1944. Everything changed. The Black Widow was stable, forgiving. The twin Pratt & Whitney R2800 engines produced 4,000 combined horsepower, top speed 366 miles per hour, 66-foot wingspan. The aircraft felt solid, responsive. But the real weapon wasn't the airframe. It was the SCR-720 radar mounted in the nose, a rotating parabolic dish that sent microwave pulses forward in a 180-degree arc. When those pulses hit an aircraft, they bounced back. The radar operator's scope displayed the return as a glowing blip, 2 displays, one showing azimuth, left or right of the aircraft's nose, one showing elevation above or below. The system could detect aircraft up to 5 miles away in complete darkness. The Japanese had no idea it existed. Their bombers flew at night because darkness made them invisible to conventional fighters. They were operating on outdated assumptions. In daylight, American P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts dominated the skies. Japanese aircraft died by the dozens. But at night, the advantage shifted. No American fighter could find targets without visual contact. And visual contact was impossible in conditions like tonight. Except Smith wasn't flying a conventional fighter. Porter's voice interrupted his thoughts. Major, first contact is now 5 miles out, still heading directly toward the airfield. Smith made his decision. We're taking all 4. Silence on the intercom. 2 seconds, 3. Then Porter's voice quieter now. Sir, the fuel math doesn't. I know the math, Porter. We're taking all 4 anyway. Another pause. How? Smith pushed the throttles forward. The twin R2800 engines responded with a deep roar. The Black Widow climbed at 2,000 feet per minute. We hunt fast. We shoot clean. We don't waste time confirming kills. The ocean will do that for us. Sir, if we burn through our fuel, then we land without fuel. But those bombers don't reach the airfield. Not one. You understand? Yes, sir. Smith heard the anxiety in Porter's voice. The radar operator understood the risk. They were betting their lives on perfect execution. 4 intercepts, 4 kills, no mistakes, no wasted ammunition, no fuel miscalculations. If they succeeded, the airfields would be safe. The invasion schedule would hold. American lives would be saved. If they failed, they would die, either in combat or when their fuel ran out and they ditched in the ocean at night. No search and rescue operated after dark. No one would find them until morning. By then they would be dead from exposure or drowned. The stakes were absolute. Porter's voice came through the intercom again. Different tone now, professional, focused. First contact bearing 035. Altitude 8,000 feet, range 4 miles. I have radar lock. Smith couldn't see anything through the canopy, just blackness. The clouds were too thick, no visual references. He relied entirely on instruments and Porter's guidance. Talk me in, left 5 degrees. Climb to 8,200. Target is maintaining course and speed, no evasive action. The bomber crew had no idea Smith was behind them. Japanese bombers carried no tail warning radar. No way to detect a pursuing night fighter. They flew through darkness believing they were safe. That assumption would kill them. Smith activated his own radar scope. A smaller display integrated into his instrument panel. When the target got close enough, he could track it himself without relying entirely on verbal instructions from Porter. Range decreased. 3 miles. 2 miles. Smith saw the target appear on his scope, a steady blip, growing larger as the distance closed. Target confirmed on my scope. I have it. Roger. Target is a Mitsubishi G4M. Betty Bomber. Smith knew the aircraft. 2,000 horsepower Mitsubishi Kasei engines. Maximum speed 270 miles per hour. Crew of 7. Bomb load 1,760 pounds. The Betty had one critical weakness: no self-sealing fuel tanks. The Japanese had prioritized range over survivability. One burst from Smith's 4 20mm cannons would turn the bomber into a fireball. Range decreased: 1 mile, 800 yards, 700. At 600 yards, Smith closed his left hand around the control column tighter. His right hand moved to the gun trigger. The 4 Hispano M2 cannons were mounted in the lower fuselage. Fixed forward, Smith had to aim the entire aircraft. He used the N6 gun sight integrated into his instrument panel. The sight projected an illuminated reticle onto a combining glass. Smith adjusted his position until the bomber sat centered in the reticle. 500 yards, still couldn't see the target visually. The darkness was absolute. 400 yards. Smith saw it. Finally, a dark shape against slightly less dark clouds. The bomber's exhaust flames were barely visible, faint orange glows from the engine nacelles. He moved the P-61 into position, slightly below the bomber, slightly behind. The approach had to be perfect. Too fast and he would overshoot. Too slow and the bomber might spot him. 350 yards. Smith armed the cannons. Each cannon carried 200 rounds, 800 rounds total, enough for approximately 40 seconds of sustained fire, but Smith wouldn't need 40 seconds. Night fighter doctrine was simple: get close, fire short bursts, confirm the kill, move to the next target. Wasting ammunition on a single bomber meant fewer rounds for the remaining targets. Smith centered the bomber in his gun sight one final time, 350 yards. Perfect range. He squeezed the trigger. The 4 cannons fired simultaneously. The sound was deafening even through the engine noise. 20mm high explosive shells streamed toward the Betty at 2,800 feet per second. The tracers looked like red lines drawn across the darkness. Smith fired for 2 seconds, 12 rounds per cannon, 48 shells total. The Betty's right wing exploded. Fuel ignited instantly. The orange fireball illuminated the clouds below. The bomber rolled right and entered a steep dive. Smith watched it fall. The burning aircraft tumbled through 7,000 feet, 6,000, 5,000. It hit the water 8 miles north of Mindoro at 23:57 hours, 15 minutes after midnight. 1 bomber down, 11 remaining. Smith checked his fuel gauge. 15% gone already. The mathematics were worse than he had calculated. Porter's voice came through the intercom. Quiet, almost hesitant. "Major, I have 3 more contacts, all still inbound, but there's something else." "What?" "The 8 distant contacts. They're turning back. They detected the kill. They know we're here." Smith processed this information instantly. The Japanese had seen the fireball. They understood an American night fighter was operating in the area. The smart move would be to abort the mission, preserve the aircraft, return tomorrow night. But 3 bombers were still coming. Either their crews were exceptionally brave or exceptionally stupid, or they simply hadn't received the order to abort yet. It didn't matter. 3 bombers meant 3 more intercepts. 3 more chances to make a mistake, 3 more fuel burns, and Smith had just learned the fuel consumption was worse than his calculations predicted. "Porter, what's our current fuel state?" A pause. Then 85%. We burned 15% on 1 intercept. "Sir, the math says—" "I know what it says. Give me vectors to the second contact." Another pause. Longer this time. Then Porter's voice, "Steady now, committed. Second contact, bearing 180, altitude 6,000 feet, range 6 miles. Smith turned the P-61 south and descended. The fuel gauge showed 85% remaining. If the consumption rate held steady, he could make 3 more intercepts. Maybe 4 if he was conservative with the throttle, but conservative flying meant slower intercepts. And slower intercepts meant bombers getting closer to Mindoro, closer to completing their mission. Smith pushed the throttles forward to maximum power. The Black Widow accelerated to 320 miles per hour. Behind him, Porter watched the fuel gauge needle drop faster than it should. Neither man spoke. They both understood what was happening. They were burning through their margin of safety with every passing second. And there were still 3 bombers inbound. The mathematics had just changed, and not in their favor. And 14 hours. December 30th, 1944. Porter's voice cut through the intercom. Second contact acquired. Bearing 180. Altitude 6,000 feet. Range 6 miles. Smith checked the distance. 23 miles from the first kill. The second bomber had continued flying south while Smith was engaged. Every second of delay meant the Betty moved closer to Mindoro, closer to the airfield, closer to 20,000 American troops sleeping below. Time was running out. At current speed, the bomber would reach the target zone in approximately 8 minutes. Smith's P-61 cruised at 280 miles per hour. That meant roughly 5 minutes to intercept. 5 minutes the bomber spent flying toward its target. Smith made his decision. He pushed the throttles to maximum power. The Black Widow accelerated to 320 miles per hour. The R-2800 engines consumed fuel at an alarming rate at high power settings. Every minute at maximum speed cost him 3 minutes of patrol time. But if he didn't intercept quickly, the bomber would reach the target zone. American anti-aircraft gunners would open fire. The bomber might get shot down by flak. Or it might release its bombs before the gunners could kill it. Either way, the mission would be incomplete. Smith had to kill this bomber before it reached Mindoro. Range decreased. 5 miles, 4 miles, 3. Porter's voice came through the intercom. Different tone now. Urgent. Major, ground radar is reporting something. The second bomber is carrying incendiaries. Smith's hands tightened on the control column. Incendiaries meant firebombs, designed to spread burning gel across wide areas. If those incendiaries hit the fuel dumps at McGuire Field, the resulting firestorm would destroy everything within a quarter mile. Aviation fuel, ammunition, aircraft, men. The Betty had to die. Now range? 2 miles. Target is maintaining course and speed. No evasive action. Smith spotted the bomber at 1 mile. Another Betty. Same profile as the first. Same vulnerable fuel tanks. The bomber was lower than the first target. 6,000 feet instead of 8,000. Closer to the cloud layer. That gave Smith less room to maneuver. He positioned the P-61 below and behind the target. The approach had to be perfect. Too fast and he would overshoot. Too slow and the bomber crew might spot him. At 500 yards, Smith saw the Betty clearly. Dark shape against dark sky. The bomber crew was flying straight and level. No evasive maneuvers. No indication they knew Smith was there. The P-61's glossy black paint made it nearly invisible at night. The engines were quieter than most fighters. Japanese aircrews called the P-61 the Black Widow. They feared it. But fear only worked if they knew it was coming. Smith centered the target in his gun sight, range 350 yards. He fired, 2-second burst, 48 rounds. The shells tore through the Betty's fuselage. The right engine caught fire immediately, then the left. Both wings were burning within seconds. The bomber nosed over and dove toward the ocean. Smith watched it fall. It hit the water at 0:19. 17 minutes after midnight. 2 bombers down, 10 remaining. Smith checked his fuel gauge, 42% remaining. 2 intercepts had consumed more than half his fuel. At this rate he might manage 2 more kills, maybe 3 if he was conservative with the throttle. But Porter still had 2 contacts on his scope, both closer to Mindoro than the previous targets, both at different altitudes, one at 9,000 feet, one at 4,000. And they were 8 miles apart. Smith made a decision. He would take the higher target first. Climbing used less fuel than rapid descent and reclimb, but the higher target was also farther north. Pursuing it meant allowing the lower bomber to get closer to the airfields. If Smith made the wrong choice, one bomber would get through. The entire mission would be considered a failure. American casualties would mount. The airfields would be damaged. The invasion schedule would slip. Smith turned north and climbed 23 hours. The P-61 reached 9,000 feet. Porter locked onto the third contact. Range 7 miles. Heading 160. Speed 190 knots. Smith frowned. 190 knots was faster than a standard Betty, and the heading was wrong. The bomber was turning. Changing altitude. Porter, confirm aircraft type. A pause while Porter studied the radar return. Contact is maneuvering. Turning left now. Descending 200 feet. Smith understood immediately. Someone aboard that aircraft knew American night fighters were in the area. Someone educated, experienced. The pilot was taking evasive action, random course changes, altitude variations. The kind of flying that made radar tracking difficult. This wasn't going to be a clean intercept. Aircraft type is Nakajima Ki 49 Donryu. We call it Helen. Smith knew the Helen. Faster than the Betty. maximum speed 306 miles per hour, better defensive armament 5.7, 7mm machine guns. The tail gunner had a clear field of fire directly behind the aircraft. Approaching from dead astern would put Smith in the gunner's sights. Smith adjusted his approach. Instead of positioning directly behind the Helen, he came from below and to the left. The bomber's blind spot. Most Japanese bombers had poor ventral coverage. The belly was vulnerable. Range decreased to 1 mile. The Helen continued its evasive maneuvers, turning left, then right. Climbing 200 feet, descending 300. The pilot was experienced. He understood that straight and level flight made his aircraft an easy target. Porter compensated, watching the pattern, predicting the next turn, anticipating the bomber's movements. "He's good," Porter said quietly. "So are we." Smith closed to 600 yards. The Helen's pilot made a sharp turn to the right. Smith followed. The P-61's twin-boom configuration gave it excellent stability. The aircraft responded smoothly to control inputs. 500 yards, 450, 400. At 375 yards, tracers streaked past Smith's canopy. The Helen's tail gunner had spotted the P-61. The element of surprise was gone. Smith had seconds to take the shot before the bomber pilot initiated aggressive evasive action. Before the entire engagement turned into a dogfight that would consume fuel and ammunition neither he nor Porter could afford to waste, he squeezed the trigger, 3-second burst, 72 rounds. Longer than his previous attacks, necessary because the Helen was maneuvering. The 20mm shells punched through the Helen's fuselage. The right engine exploded, debris separated from the air. The bomber rolled inverted and entered a spin. Smith pulled away to avoid the debris field. The burning aircraft fell through 9,000 feet, 8,000, 7,000. It hit the water at 0.29. 29 minutes after midnight. 3 bombers down, 9 remaining. Smith checked his fuel gauge, 28%. Critical level. Most pilots returned to base at 30% fuel. Below that, any delay could result in a forced landing, or worse. Running out of fuel over open ocean at night meant certain death. No visual references, no way to judge altitude. The aircraft would hit the water before the pilot realized how low he was flying. Porter's voice came through the intercom. "Quiet, strained. Major, we got lucky on that one." "How do you mean?" "The radar nearly lost lock when he was maneuvering. I almost couldn't guide you in, if he'd been any better at evasive flying." Porter didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Both men understood. They had been seconds away from losing the intercept, seconds away from the Helen escaping, seconds away from failure. Smith pushed the thought away. "What about the fourth contact?" "Heading 170, altitude 4,000 feet, range 9 miles. This was the bomber Smith had bypassed earlier, the one flying at low altitude." It was now only 12 miles from Mindoro, close enough that Smith could see the searchlights from the American airfields, thin beams of white light sweeping the sky. Anti-aircraft batteries were ready. Gunners had their fingers on triggers, waiting for targets. Smith descended toward the fourth bomber, diving conserved fuel. The P-61 dropped through 8,000 feet, 7,000, 6,000, 5,000. Smith leveled off at 4,200 feet, slightly above the target. The altitude advantage gave him better position for the attack. He could dive on the bomber from above. Use gravity to increase his speed, reduce the time the target had to react. Range decreased, 4 miles, 3 miles, 2 miles. Smith acquired the target visually at 1 mile. Another Betty. The bomber was flying straight toward Mindoro. No evasive action. The pilot either didn't know American night fighters were in the area or didn't care. Perhaps he believed his mission was more important than his survival. Japanese bomber crews often accepted death as the price of completing their objectives. Duty above life, honor above survival. Smith understood that mindset. He was operating under the same principle tonight. The AA gunners at Mindoro were on the radio now. Smith could hear their chatter on the emergency frequency. "We have visual contact on inbound bomber. Range 3 miles. We can take him." Smith keyed his microphone. His voice was cold, negative. "Stand down. He's mine." A pause on the radio, then the AA battery commander's voice. "Roger, standing down, he's yours." Smith positioned the P-61 for the kill, below and behind, 350 yards. He checked his ammunition counter. 512 rounds remaining, enough for 3 more attacks, maybe 4 if he was conservative. But this was the 4th target. He needed to make every shot count. His fuel gauge showed 23%, below safety margins. If he engaged this bomber and missed, he wouldn't have enough fuel to pursue it again. One chance, one burst. Then he had to return to base whether the bomber was destroyed or still flying. Smith centered the Betty in his gun sight. He fired at .34, 2-second burst, 48 rounds. The 20mm shells converged on the Betty's center fuselage. The port wing separated from the aircraft, fuel tanks ruptured, fire spread across the remaining wing structure. The Betty rolled left and dove toward the ocean. It impacted at 0035, 35 minutes after midnight. 4 bombers destroyed in 55 minutes. Smith turned the P-61 back toward Mindoro. His fuel gauge showed 21%. The calculation was simple. McGuire Field was 18 miles south. The Black Widow consumed approximately 100 gallons per hour at cruise speed. Smith had roughly 60 gallons remaining. At cruise speed, he could fly for another 36 minutes, more than enough to reach the airfield, unless something went wrong. Porter scanned his radar scope for additional contacts. Nothing. The remaining 8 Japanese bombers had turned back. Whether they detected Smith's attacks or simply lost their nerve was irrelevant. The mission was accomplished. 4 kills, 0 American casualties. The airfields were safe. Construction crews would work through the night without interruption. The Lingayen Gulf invasion schedule remained intact. But Smith's night wasn't over. 42 hours. Porter's voice came through the intercom, different tone now. Confused. Major, I have a new contact. Heading north, range 4 miles, altitude 7,000 feet. Smith checked his position. He was 12 miles from McGuire Field, fuel at 19%. The contact was between Smith and his base. If it was a Japanese bomber, it was heading toward the airfield Smith had just defended. Engaging it would consume more fuel, possibly too much fuel. Smith might not make it back to base. The alternative was worse. Letting a Japanese bomber reach Mindoro unchallenged. Smith had destroyed 4 aircraft. If a 5th bomber got through and killed American personnel, the entire night's work would be tainted. Numbers didn't matter if someone died because Smith prioritized his own survival over mission completion. Smith turned toward the contact. Porter called vectors. The range closed rapidly. 3 miles, 2 miles, 1 mile. Smith acquired the target visually at 800 yards. It wasn't a bomber. It was a Nakajima Ki-84 Hayate. The Americans called it Frank, a single-engine fighter, maximum speed 392 miles per hour, 412 7mm machine guns, 2 20mm cannons. One of the best Japanese fighters in service, the Frank was faster than the P-61, more maneuverable, better rate of climb. In daylight, a skilled Frank pilot could outfight a Black Widow. But this wasn't daylight, and the Frank pilot had no radar. He was flying blind, searching for American aircraft using visual references that didn't exist in complete darkness. Smith had one advantage. The Frank pilot didn't know Smith was there. Porter's voice cut through the intercom. Urgent now. Major, that's not a bomber, that's a fighter. We should disengage. Smith didn't respond immediately. He was calculating. The Frank was heading directly toward Mindoro, toward the wreckage of the 4 bombers Smith had just destroyed. If the Frank pilot found that wreckage, he would report it to Japanese command. They would know an American night fighter was operating in the area. They would know their bombers were vulnerable. Future intercepts would be more difficult. Bomber crews would take more aggressive, evasive action. They would fly at different altitudes, different speeds. They would make Porter's job harder, or worse. The Frank pilot might locate one of the burning wrecks while crew members were still alive. He might rescue them. Those crew members would report that they never saw their attacker. Never heard engine noise, never had warning. Japanese intelligence would piece it together. Radar-equipped night fighters, invisible hunters in darkness. The tactical advantage Smith's squadron held would be compromised. Smith made his decision. We're engaging. Sir, our fuel. I know about the fuel, Porter. We can't let him reach those wrecks. He can't know what killed them. A pause, then Porter's voice. Resigned. Understood. Target bearing 045, range 600 yards. Smith positioned the P-61 below and behind the fighter, range 500 yards. The approach was identical to his bomber intercepts. Get close. Fire. Confirm the kill. But fighters were smaller targets, harder to hit, and the Frank had armor protection around the cockpit and engine. A 2-second burst might not be enough. Smith closed to 300 yards. His fuel gauge showed 17%. If he missed this shot, he wouldn't have time for a second attempt. He would have to disengage immediately and hope he had enough fuel to reach Maguire Field. Missing the shot also meant the Frank pilot would know American night fighters were in the area. The element of surprise would be lost. Smith centered the Frank in his gun sight. His finger rested on the trigger. The mathematics were clear. Engaging the fighter would drop his fuel to 15%. Below minimum safety margin. But letting it go meant risking American lives on the ground, meant compromising the tactical advantage that made missions like tonight possible. The P-61's engines hummed steadily at 320 miles per hour. The Frank flew straight and level, unaware it was being hunted. Smith made his decision at no 45. He squeezed the trigger. 3-second burst, 72 rounds, the longest burst of the night. The shells tore through the Frank's tail section and engine cowling. The Frank's engine burst into flames. Black smoke poured from the cowling. The fighter rolled right and dove. Smith watched it descend through 7,000 feet, 6,000, 5,000. The flames grew larger. At 3,000 feet, the pilot ejected. Smith saw the parachute open. A white canopy against black sky. The pilot would survive. Japanese naval patrols operated in these waters. They would rescue him by morning. He would report what happened. An invisible attacker in complete darkness. Smith didn't know the pilot's name. Just another contact, another kill, another step toward protecting the airfield below. The Frank continued its dive and hit the water at 146. Smith checked his fuel gauge. 15%. The engagement had consumed more fuel than calculated. Maguire Field was 11 miles south. The P-61's fuel consumption at cruise speed meant Smith had approximately 22 minutes of flight time remaining. Enough to reach the airfield with minimal reserves. But any headwind or navigation error would exhaust his fuel before landing. Porter's voice came through the intercom. Quiet, controlled. But Smith could hear the fear underneath. Major, we need to get on the ground now. Agreed. Give me a heading to Mindoro. Porter guided Smith toward the island using radar navigation. The island appeared on the scope as a large landmass. Maguire Field was on the southwestern coast. The airfield had been operational for only 4 days. Minimal lighting. No instrument landing system. Pilots landing at night relied on a single row of kerosene lamps marking the runway. From 5 miles out, those lamps looked like dim yellow dots, easy to miss in darkness. Smith descended to 2,000 feet. His fuel gauge showed 13%. The P-61's fuel tanks held 646 gallons total. 13% meant 84 gallons remaining. At cruise power settings, that provided 18 minutes of flight time. Smith was 8 miles from the airfield. At 280 miles per hour, that meant approximately 1.7 minutes to reach the landing pattern. Enough fuel, barely. At 052, Smith spotted the runway lights, 12 dim lamps arranged in a line. The runway was 5,000 feet long, crushed coral surface. Engineers had completed construction on December 26th. The same day, the 418th Night Fighter Squadron arrived. The runway was adequate for P-61 operations, but it lacked the safety features of established airfields. No overrun area, no crash barriers. If Smith landed too fast or too slow, the aircraft would leave the runway. At night, with minimal lighting, any landing error would likely be fatal. Smith entered the landing pattern at 1,000 feet. His fuel gauge showed 11%, 57 gallons. The P-61 consumed fuel faster during landing approach. Power settings fluctuated. Engines spooled up during turns. Spooled down during descents. Each power change consumed additional fuel. Smith calculated he had approximately 12 minutes of fuel remaining, more than enough to land, unless something went wrong. At 055, something went wrong. The runway lights went out. All 12 lamps extinguished simultaneously. Complete darkness. Smith was 3 miles from the runway. Altitude 800 feet. Airspeed 140 knots. Without runway lights, he had no visual reference for landing. The P-61 would hit the ground before Smith realized how low he was flying. Porter's voice came through the intercom. Tight. Controlled. Runway lights are out. Sir, we need. I know. Smith's mind was already working through the problem. He remembered the intelligence briefing from 2 days earlier. Japanese infiltrators had been reported near the airfield, saboteurs. The briefing officer had mentioned possible attacks on infrastructure. This wasn't mechanical failure. This was sabotage. Porter suggested using the radar altimeter. The device measured height above ground by bouncing radio waves off the surface. Accurate to within 50 feet, Smith could descend slowly using the altimeter and dead reckoning navigation. When the altimeter showed 0 feet, he would be on the ground. The technique was dangerous. Any error in navigation meant landing off the runway, hitting trees, coral reefs, construction equipment. Smith's fuel gauge showed 9%, 46 gallons, 8 minutes of flight time, not enough to divert to another airfield. Tacloban-on-Leyte was the nearest alternative, 90 miles northeast. The P-61 would run out of fuel 40 miles short. Smith had one option: land at McGuire Field without runway lights, or crash into the ocean and hope someone rescued him before he drowned. The decision was simple. Smith had survived 4 intercepts, 5 kills in 55 minutes, the highest single-night total for any American night fighter pilot in the Pacific Theater. He had saved American lives on the ground, protected the airfields, enabled the Lingayen Gulf invasion to proceed on schedule. Dying now because of extinguished runway lights would make the entire mission meaningless. Smith turned the P-61 toward where he believed the runway was located. His altitude was 600 feet, fuel at 9%, the darkness below was absolute. Porter! I need you on the radar altimeter. Call out altitude every 50 feet. Yes, sir. Smith descended to 400 feet. The radar altimeter showed 380 feet above ground level. He reduced airspeed to 120 knots. The P-61's stall speed was 95 knots with flaps fully extended. Flying at 120 knots gave Smith a 25-knot safety margin. Not much, but descending slower would consume more fuel. Porter monitored the radar scope. The coastline of Mindoro showed clearly. McGuire Field was inland, approximately 1 mile from the beach. Smith used compass heading to navigate. The runway ran north-south. Smith approached from the north. His heading was 180 degrees. If his navigation was accurate, the runway would be directly ahead. If not, he would land in jungle, or construction areas, or coral reefs. At 0:58, Smith extended the landing gear. 3 green indicator lights confirmed all 3 wheels were down and locked. Main gear under each engine nacelle, nose gear under the forward fuselage. The P-61's landing gear was robust, designed to handle rough airfields. But landing without visual references meant Smith couldn't judge his touchdown point. He might hit too hard, collapse the gear, the aircraft would cartwheel. At 120 knots, the crew would not survive. Smith's fuel gauge showed 7%, 36 gallons, 5 minutes remaining. He extended flaps to full. The P-61's airspeed decreased to 110 knots. The aircraft descended at 300 feet per minute. The radar altimeter showed 250 feet, 200, 150. Smith couldn't see the ground. No lights, no visual references, just instruments and the hope that his navigation was correct. Porter's voice came through the intercom. Steady, professional, 100 feet. Smith reduced power. The descent rate increased to 400 feet per minute, faster than normal. But necessary to reach the ground before his fuel ran out. 75 feet, 50 feet, 25 feet. Smith prepared for touchdown. His hands gripped the control column. His feet rested on the rudder pedals, ready to correct for any deviation. The P-61's main wheels hit crushed coral at 0:59. The impact was harder than normal. Smith felt the jolt through the airframe, but the landing gear held. The nose wheel touched down 3 seconds later. Smith applied brakes. The P-61 decelerated rapidly, 100 knots. 80, 60, 40. The aircraft slowed to taxi speed at 20 knots. Smith couldn't see where he was on the runway. He kept the brakes applied until the P-61 stopped completely. His fuel gauge showed 6%, 29 gallons, 3 minutes of fuel remaining. Ground crew arrived with flashlights. They guided Smith to the parking area. The P-61's engines shut down at 013. 1 hour and 3 minutes after takeoff, Smith climbed out of the cockpit. His legs were stiff, his hands were shaking, not from fear, from exhaustion. 5 intercepts, 5 kills. 1 blind landing, all in 63 minutes of combat. Porter climbed out from the radar operator's compartment. He had tracked 5 targets successfully, vectored Smith to each intercept, maintained radar contact throughout the engagement. Night fighting was a team effort. Perfect coordination between pilot and radar operator. Smith provided the firepower, Porter provided the eyes. The ground crew inspected the P-61. No damage. All 4 cannons had functioned correctly. Total ammunition expended, 408 rounds. Smith had started the mission with 800 rounds. He landed with 392 rounds remaining. Enough ammunition for 2 more intercepts, but 0 fuel for pursuing additional targets. Row 1 15 hours. Intelligence officers arrived. They wanted details, times, locations, altitudes, aircraft types. Smith provided the information from memory. 4 Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers, 1 Nakajima Ki-49 Helen bomber, 1 Nakajima Ki-84 Frankfurter, all destroyed between 23:57 on December 29th and 46 on December 30th. Total engagement time, 49 minutes. The intelligence officers confirmed the kills through multiple sources. Ground radar had tracked the intercepts. Coast watchers reported seeing aircraft crash into the ocean. Wreckage was visible at first light. 4 bombers, 1 fighter, all exactly where Smith reported. Porter sat on an ammunition crate. His hands were shaking now. The adrenaline was wearing off. The reality of what they had just accomplished was settling in. One of the intelligence officers turned to Smith. Major. 4 kills in 1 night ties the record for American night fighters in the Pacific. You're aware of that? Smith's expression didn't change. There were 12 bombers inbound tonight. 8 of them turned back. That means we only stopped 4. The intelligence officer frowned. Sir, you saved the airfield. You prevented. I know what we prevented. I also know what we didn't prevent. 8 bombers are still out there. They'll come back tomorrow night, or the night after. Silence. The intelligence officer looked at Porter. Then back at Smith. Major, you just accomplished something no other night fighter crew in this theater has managed. You should. Smith cut him off. We did our job, nothing more. He turned and walked toward the operations tent. Porter watched him go. The intelligence officers watched Porter. One of them spoke quietly. Is he always like that? Porter nodded. Yes, sir, he is. Porter stood. His legs were unsteady. The exhaustion was catching up to him now. Sir, there's something else you should know. What's that? The fighter we shot down. The Frank. The pilot ejected. He survived. The intelligence officer made a note on his clipboard. Japanese naval patrols operate in those waters. They'll pick him up by morning. That's what I'm concerned about, sir. He'll report being attacked without warning, without visual contact. The intelligence officer understood immediately. He'll report the radar capability. Yes, sir. A pause. Then the intelligence officer closed his notebook. There's nothing we can do about that now, Lieutenant. The engagement happened. The pilot survived. He'll report what he experienced. Yes, sir. Porter turned to leave. The intelligence officer called after him. Lieutenant, for what it's worth, you and Major Smith just saved a lot of American lives tonight. Whatever that Japanese pilot reports doesn't change that fact. Porter nodded, but he didn't feel relief. He felt something else. A sense that the night's mission had accomplished its objective, but created a new problem in the process. The Japanese knew about the radar now, or they would soon. And that knowledge would change everything. December 30th, 1944, 14:30 hours. Major Carroll Smith stood beside his P-61 Black Widow at McGuire Field. The tropical sun beat down on the crushed coral runway. His flight suit was still damp with sweat from the morning briefing. 12 hours had passed since the blind landing. 12 hours since he and Porter had walked away from the aircraft that should have killed them. 12 hours of fitful sleep interrupted by the sound of phantom engines and the image of burning aircraft falling into darkness. The squadron commander had ordered Smith to stand down, rest, recover, let another crew take the afternoon patrol. Smith had refused. "Sir, there are Japanese reconnaissance aircraft operating over Mindoro. Someone needs to intercept them." The commander had studied Smith's face, looking for signs of exhaustion, signs of stress, signs that the previous night's mission had pushed Smith beyond his limits. He saw none. Smith's expression was the same as always, calm, controlled, detached. The commander signed the mission authorization. "One patrol, 2 hours maximum. You're back on the ground by 1700 hours. "Understood?" "Yes, sir. But there was a problem. Lieutenant Porter was grounded. The flight surgeon had examined him that morning and found his hands still shaking, his blood pressure elevated." Signs of acute stress response. Porter was not cleared to fly. Smith would be flying with a replacement radar operator, a young lieutenant transferred from another squadron 2 weeks earlier. Experience level, minimal. Combat missions, 0. Smith met the new radar operator at the aircraft. The lieutenant couldn't have been more than 22 years old. His name tag read Morrison. Morrison saluted. His hand was steady, but Smith could see the nervousness in his eyes. "Sir, I've studied the radar procedures. I know the intercept protocols. I won't let you down." Smith returned the salute. "Just call out what you see on the scope. I'll handle the rest." They climbed into the P-61. Smith in the pilot's seat, Morrison in Porter's compartment. The engine started without issue. The same aircraft that had hunted 5 Japanese aircraft the previous night, the same cannons, the same radar, but everything felt different. Porter's absence created a void that Morrison couldn't fill, not because Morrison was incompetent, but because Smith and Porter had developed an understanding over 6 months of flying together. A rhythm. An instinct for each other's thoughts. That understanding couldn't be replicated in a single mission. Smith pushed the thought away, focused on the checklist, focused on the mission. The P-61 lifted off at 14:35 hours, 15:12 hours. Morrison's voice came through the intercom, uncertain, hesitant. "Major, I have a contact. Bearing 020, altitude 12,000 feet, range 8 miles. Smith checked his position. The contact was north of Mindoro. Heading south, fast, confirm aircraft type, a pause, longer than Porter would have taken, contact speed is approximately 350 knots. So that's too fast for a bomber. Smith understood immediately. Fighter, another Key 84 Frank. Japanese reconnaissance flights continued despite the previous night's losses. The pilot was likely searching for the missing bomber formations. Routine patrol turned deadly intercept. The Frank pilot had no idea Smith was hunting him. Smith climbed to intercept. The P-61 reached 12,500 feet. Morrison guided him toward the contact. The intercepts were slower than with Porter. Morrison's corrections were less precise, his predictions of the target's movement less accurate. But they were adequate. Range decreased. 5 miles. 4, 3. At 2 miles, Smith acquired the target visually. Key 84 Frank. Single engine. Distinctive profile. The fighter was maintaining course and speed. No evasive action. The pilot was either inexperienced or believed he was safe. He was wrong. Smith had one advantage Morrison's inexperience couldn't negate. Altitude. The P-61 was 500 feet above the Frank. Smith could dive on the target from above, use gravity to increase his speed, close the distance before the Frank pilot could react. Smith pushed the nose down. The Black Widow accelerated in the dive, 300 miles per hour, 320, 350, faster than the Frank's maximum level speed. The range closed rapidly, 1 mile, half mile, quarter mile. At 400 yards, the Frank pilot saw him. The fighter broke left, hard turn, maximum G-force, trying to evade, too late. Smith fired 2-second burst. 48 rounds. The shells converged on the Frank's engine. The cowling disintegrated. Fire erupted from the engine compartment. Black smoke poured from the aircraft. The Frank rolled inverted and entered a dive. Smith watched it fall. 12,000 feet. 10,000, 8,000, no parachute. The pilot stayed with the aircraft, either trapped in the cockpit or making a deliberate choice to ride the fighter down. The Frank hit the ocean at 15:13. Smith's 7th confirmed kill. The pilot stayed with the aircraft, no parachute, no rescue, just another kill in a war full of kills. Smith didn't know his name, wouldn't know it for years. Morrison's voice came through the intercom, excited, almost jubilant. "We got him, sir. That's a confirmed kill." Smith didn't respond immediately. He was watching the spot where the Frank had hit the water, a circle of disturbed white foam, already fading. "Yes," Smith said finally, "confirmed," but his voice carried no satisfaction. No pride, just acknowledgement of fact. Morrison seemed to notice the tone. "Sir, are you? Let's head back to base." Smith turned the P-61 toward Mindoro. The highest single-night total of any American night fighter pilot in World War II, a record that would never be broken, but Smith felt nothing, no triumph, no accomplishment, just emptiness. Porter should have been here. Porter should have been the one guiding him to the intercept. Porter should have been the one celebrating the kill. Without Porter, the victory felt incomplete. The P-61 landed at McGuire Field at 15:47 hours. Smith shut down the engines and climbed out. Morrison followed. The young lieutenant was still excited, still processing what had just happened. "Sir, that was incredible. The way you dove on him. He never had a chance. Smith removed his flight helmet. He had a chance. He just didn't know we were there until it was too late." Morrison didn't understand the distinction, but Smith did. The numbers told the story. The 418th Night Fighter Squadron recorded 18 total kills during World War II, the highest total of any P-61 squadron in the Pacific Theater. Smith's 7 kills accounted for 39% of the squadron's total score. In the 2 weeks following Smith's missions on December 29th and 30th, Japanese night bombing raids over Mindoro decreased by 80%. The few bombers that did attack flew at higher altitudes, took more evasive action, released their bombs early, and turned back before reaching the target zone. The airfields at McGuire Field and Hillfield were completed on schedule. January 1st, 1945, P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts began operating from both fields on January 2nd. When American forces landed at Lingayen Gulf on January 9th, those fighters provided continuous air cover. Losses were lower than expected. The invasion proceeded ahead of schedule. American engineers later calculated that if the Japanese bombing raids on December 29th had succeeded, construction would have been delayed by at least 2 weeks. The Lingayen invasion would have been postponed. Casualties would have mounted during the extended timeline. Smith's 5 kills on the night of December 29th potentially saved 2,000 American lives, but that calculation didn't include the other side of the equation. 5 Japanese bombers destroyed, 1 Japanese fighter, approximately 35 to 40 Japanese aircrew killed across those 6 aircraft, men with men families, men with names. Men who believed they were fighting for their country, just as surely as Smith believed he was fighting for his. War's calculations were always incomplete. The intelligence reports arrived 3 weeks later. The Ki-84 Frank pilot, who had ejected on the night of December 29th, had been rescued by Japanese naval patrol. He filed a report about the engagement before returning to his unit. An invisible attacker in complete darkness, no visual contact, no engine noise until after the attack. The attacker appeared to know his exact position despite the darkness. Japanese intelligence analyzed his report alongside similar accounts from other theaters. They drew the inevitable conclusion: the Americans had developed radar-equipped night fighters. By February 1945, Japanese bomber crews were receiving briefings about the new threat. Tactics were adjusted. Bombing raids became more cautious, more defensive. The tactical advantage the P-61 squadrons had enjoyed for 4 months was diminished, not eliminated, but reduced. Smith learned about the intelligence leak in March 1945. By that time, he was flying his 58th combat mission. The engagement patterns had already changed. Japanese bombers were harder to intercept, more aggressive in their evasive flying. Smith understood the connection. His decision to engage the Frank on December 29th had saved American lives that night, but it had also compromised the tactical advantage that could have saved more lives in the months that followed. The irony was not lost on him. After the war, Smith learned the name of the pilot from his 7th kill, Sergeant Akira Kusano, 23 years old, 57 combat missions. Just 3 years younger than Smith, Cusano had died in the engagement. No ejection, no rescue, just another name on the casualty lists that both sides compiled after every mission. Smith felt the weight of that knowledge. Cusano had been doing his duty, Smith had been doing his. War had made them enemies, death had made them equals. At least one name had a face now. That somehow made it both worse and more real. Smith returned to the United States in February 1946. He left the military 6 months later, became a civilian, found work, built a life far away from the Pacific Theater and the memories that haunted it. He never sought publicity, never wrote memoirs, never gave interviews about the missions that had made him the top American night fighter ace of World War II. When journalists contacted him, he declined politely. When military historians requested his participation in documentary films, he refused. The only records of his achievements existed in military archives, unit histories, intelligence reports, after-action summaries. The dry documentation of kills confirmed and missions accomplished. Lieutenant Porter received the Distinguished Flying Cross for his role as radar operator on the night of December 29th. The citation recognized his skill in guiding Smith to 4 successful intercepts under extreme conditions. Smith was recommended for the same medal. He declined the honor, told his commanding officer that he had simply done his job, nothing more. The recommendation was filed anyway. The medal was awarded. Smith never attended the ceremony, never wore the decoration. Porter tried to contact Smith several times after the war. Letters went unanswered. Phone calls were politely deflected. Smith had made a decision. The war was over. The missions were complete. Talking about them wouldn't change what had happened, wouldn't bring back the Japanese aircrew who had died, wouldn't erase the memories of burning aircraft falling into darkness. Silence seemed more appropriate than celebration. Porter died in 1987. Smith attended the funeral, stood in the back of the church, didn't speak to the family, left before the reception. Smith died in 2003, 79 years old. The obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his military service in a single sentence: veteran of World War II, served in the Pacific Theater. No mention of the 7 kills. No mention of the record. No mention of the night that made him the top American night fighter ace of the war. That was how Smith wanted it. The P-61 Black Widow times a Wastin was scrapped in 1946, melted down for metal, recycled, disappeared. The nose art was lost. The kill markings were lost. The aircraft that had hunted 4 bombers in 80 minutes ceased to exist. Only 4 P-61 Black Widows survive today in museums. None of them is Smith's aircraft. The 418th Night Fighter Squadron was deactivated in 1947, reformed briefly during the Korean War, deactivated again in 1952. The unit history was filed in the National Archives. Most of it remains unread. The technology Smith and Porter used on December 29, 1944, became the foundation for modern air combat doctrine, radar-equipped fighters, beyond visual range intercepts, first look, first shot, first kill. Every F-14 Tomcat, every F-15 Eagle, every F-22 Raptor, every modern fighter aircraft carries the legacy of that night over Mindoro, but Smith never claimed credit for that legacy. Never suggested his missions influenced the future of aerial warfare. He understood something that most people didn't. War wasn't about records, wasn't about achievements, wasn't about glory. War was about doing what was necessary. Protecting the people who couldn't protect themselves, making impossible decisions with incomplete information, and living with the consequences. Smith had done that. Porter had done that. Thousands of other men had done that across every theater of the war. The fact that history remembered some names and forgot others didn't change the fundamental reality. They had all served. They had all sacrificed. They had all paid the cost that war demanded. Smith's silence wasn't about modesty. It was about respect. Respect for the men who flew beside him. Respect for the men who died in the aircraft he shot down. Respect for the enormous weight of responsibility that came with taking human life in service of a larger cause. That weight never left him. He carried it quietly until the day he died. The records remain in the archives. The statistics remain in the unit histories. The story remains for those who choose to seek it out. But Smith himself chose silence, and perhaps that choice tells us more about the true nature of courage than any medal or commendation ever could.